Hi, Richard here from Learn, Implement, Share. What you're about to see is a recorded discussion that I had with Heidi Rhodes. Heidi is a brilliant mathematics educator based in VERSO International School in Thailand. Heidi has also had extensive experience working with groups of schools, with the mathematics departments, raising standards, building culture, improving outcomes, etc., etc. So Heidi and I have a lot of shared interests and common ground. This is our second chat. We hadn't planned the discussion, we hadn't planned to record it, but 2 minutes in I said, hang on, stop, let's record this because this could be worth saving. So we had a phenomenal conversation, mostly around the traditional approach to teaching mathematics, why it's so common, how it's flawed, what the alternative is where everybody wins, why there's so few people using an alternative where outcomes are better, teachers are happier, students are understanding more have more agency, etc. What the misconceptions are, why teachers struggle to transition from a traditional approach to this kind of alternative, and what can be done to help pave the way so that teachers can transition much more easily. So that was the flavour of the discussion. And although we're on the same page, there were certain fundamental points that Heidi and I disagreed on, which made the conversation even more interesting. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. You don't have to watch this, just listen to it, and would love to hear what your takeaways are. So enjoy. As we were saying, I just think there's a lot more teachers that anyone's prepared to admit, maths teachers, who fully believe that the most efficient way to teach maths is what I call a procedures first approach. Mm-hmm. So I'm the maths teacher. I walk in the classroom. My job is I've got to get through these next 5 procedures and give them lots of practice. I run a tight ship. I've been doing this for 127 years. I know I'm good at it. And I don't let them talk too much. I keep everything under control. And, it's boom, boom, boom. Make sure they get lots of practice and drill, drill, drill. And then they'll be right for the test. And I wish I could be more engaging. I wish they could have more fun and have more interaction and all that, but we don't have time for that because and especially in the higher levels.
Yeah.
So you that's what you see as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I'm a little more optimistic than you. I don't think I believe that there are a lot of teachers who do believe that they're not doing something right, that there's something that they could do differently. They just don't know how to do it. And they don't want their kids to sit and be bored and be regurgitating all day long. So I think there's more of a hunger for what do I do differently, but I don't think they know. And I think it's such a complex answer that we go with, let's be efficient. And that's the word that I've heard as well. I just want efficiency. The most efficient way is to teach kids over and over. But then you say, if it was really efficient, you wouldn't have to reteach things that they learned 26 times between then and now. So it's not efficient, but.
So let's name and shame some of these misconceptions, because it's not teachers' fault. I had the same misconceptions, totally had the same misconceptions. And I was one of those teachers who knew damn well that I was not doing a good job and I was floundering and I didn't know anyone who did any better.
Right.
That was my first years of teaching.
Yeah. And I went to, when I was just out of college, my senior year of college, the NCTM put out the first set of standards. And I remember reading them and saying, this is gorgeous. How in the world do you do it? Because the only teaching I had ever seen was what you're talking about. And so I think that part of it is I had a picture, and actually for many, many years, I had this idea that I know what NCTM is telling me and I believe what they're telling me, but I had no idea what it actually looks like in practice.
What you're saying is what's needed is some sort of roadmap. Like for someone who wants to go from, I don't want to, but I know that I'm boring the pants off my kids and I know that I'm just teaching procedures mostly. That's my default approach. And mostly it doesn't work very well. And I know that 80% of the kids don't really get it. And I hope that they're compliant, because then the ones that are not compliant, they're a real problem. But I don't know what to do. That's what you're saying. And I suspect that a lot of the information that is trying to shift them to provide a roadmap, I think it gets very complicated and convoluted. And I don't actually think it is that difficult. I don't think it's that complicated.
I think I disagree with you.
Okay, beautiful. So,
I think it is complicated.
okay, please explain.
I haven't, I have to think through this a minute. To me, it was reimagining what I ask kids to do every day in class. And that when all I had was that kids need to, and I believe, I mean, I just had a conversation this morning in the car, that math is a problem-based subject. And so you have to have them solving problems. And so I didn't know, and the textbook certainly at that time didn't give any guidance for what types of things could you ask kids to be doing that they could tackle by themselves or with their teammates. And so once I went to a class and I saw I got to get kids talking more about important things, then it became about what? And so the curriculum was just a bunch of problems that got, went from question A, the A set to the C set, and they got harder down the page, but they all looked the same. So there really wasn't even anything to think about there. They were just mimicking what I did. So I became interested in this when I was in ninth grade because I had a teacher who I worked with after school, and he helped me see that it was actually all connected. It was this web. And so he's like, when you have fractions and you do 1/2 plus 2/3, you can't, that's the same as this algebraic situation, and look at how and why. And it was there that I started to see, there are these connections that aren't visible unless you make them visible. So I didn't know how to make those connections visible to kids because nothing I had in front of me showed me that. So I think it's pretty complex because you're not only re-envisioning, then you have to have something to put in front of kids every day. And then you have to trust that I've gotten worse before I'm going to get better because I know how to do what I know how to do. I don't know how to do what I'm trying to do. And so I'm going to get worse. And then, so that's actually another piece, I think, that makes it complex.
Yeah, look, I'll put in a disclaimer that I am well known for blanket statements that trip me up, right? But I think the complexity is that if you're starting out teaching mathematics and you don't have a full, like you don't see that web, then you're picking up your textbook the night before and working out what you've got to teach the next day, right? To go from there to be able to see a much bigger picture and teach from that much bigger picture, that's complex, but you can't really teach that. That's really an experience thing. But as long as a new teacher, it's going to take time, but as long as that person understands that we're aiming to have the students explore rather than just copy down whatever I say and regurgitate whatever I say as a teacher, as long as that's their intention and they know that's the path, and it might take them a couple of years, I think that's okay. But so I think there's complexity there.
But don't you think it's hard to look at a traditional textbook and go, how do I solve this equation or draw the graph that shows you into something that's even worth exploring? I think to me, that was a piece of it. It's not even worth exploring it. I should just tell you how to do it because there's nothing interesting to look at in it. There's nothing to make me curious, nothing to make me, there's one way to do it, really, if you're going to do it the most efficient way. So why don't I just...
All right. So this is such a big topic, right?
Yes.
What we're talking about is, if I'm a teacher, how can I go from teaching traditionally, where it's procedurally based, and I know that 80% of the kids don't really get it, but that's all I know as a teacher, to having a situation where the students have much more agency over what they're doing, much more understanding, much more engagement, much more success, and where a fair chunk of that 80% at least have a good sense of what they're doing because they're using their own thinking rather than using the teacher's thinking. Really what we're talking about, isn't it? And because I said it's easy, which is or uncomplicated. So there's a couple of things. Like you could go fully, vertical whiteboards or full problem-based learning or full inquiry-based approach. So you basically, tear up the textbook and look at everything, rearrange it, and then work on themes. And And I agree, trying to do that and meet all the ticks, all the check boxes from the syllabus is really, really, really difficult. And I take my hat off to people who do it. And more importantly, to try to get a department of teachers to drop what they're doing and adopt that is a big ask. And I think that's why those kind of approaches get a bit of a bad rap, because they work really well if the teacher, I think it takes a certain kind of teacher to be able to do that really well, and a very experienced teacher. So that's a problem. I mean, I love the idea of all that. And if we weren't so wedded to our syllabuses, then it would definitely be a better thing, because at least we're giving the students a sense of what mathematics is and what it is to think mathematically and to be a bit of a mathematician. And that's really what we want. That's more important than most of what we're teaching, I think. And you mentioned before we went on air the Mathematician's Lament. If anyone hasn't read that, just read half it. It's like going to take you 15, 20 minutes. And that pretty much sums up the situation that we're in. It's a brilliant read. I don't think I've ever finished the whole thing, but it was enough just reading the first half of it. But I reckon there's still a way that we can teach a traditional curriculum from a textbook, if you want, in ways that have the students thinking a lot more. I mean, no, you can't just teach out the text. What I'm saying is you might be using the text as the basis. Okay, here's the topic we're going to do, but I've got a bunch of other worksheets and other activities I'm going to wed into this unit, right? But I might still be using a text as a basis. So that pretty much states that it is still a fairly conventional kind of approach. So then you think, well, the way I started teaching, like the fully procedural approach, does not give any chance for kids to have agency. It's not my fault. It's that approach just fundamentally cannot allow kids to take ownership, because by default, if I'm the teacher, they are simply trying to regurgitate whatever I've said and to copy me. And that's the opposite to agency. So how can I, as a conventional teacher, what can I tweak? How can I change things up so as kids have some agency? And one thing is creating a need to learn. So you just mentioned there's activities in the books that are kind of meaningless. Well, here's one meaningless activity. Go down to like year 7, 8, or year 6, 7, 8, right? Adding fractions with different denominators, simplifying fractions, all of that sort of work. I mean, I just taught that stuff because it was in the text, it was in the curriculum, and then I started thinking, it's a dangerous thing to do, to think. And I was thinking, what's the point of this? And the only thing I could come up with is that it's used in algebra. That's really the only reason to do that stuff. I think kids need to understand how fractions of different parts can add together and simplify down, but not the ones that require a whole lot of complicated cancelling, right? You need that if you get to algebra and you start doing algebraic fractions. So I had this year 8 class at the time, and I thought, I'm not going to teach it. I'm not going to teach that stuff until we get to algebra. And then we're doing algebra, and then we had algebraic fractions. And I said, right, we better learn how to work with fractions, because we have to do it with algebra. Now it's not a big sort of need to learn, but it was big enough because kids then could see some sort of reason for learning these cancellation things and whatever. And so we did both that stuff together. So I would design these questions with the fractions, and then exactly the same question with algebra, and they're just doing them together. So I thought, well, that saved me time. And the kids got it because there was some reason to do it. So I think we can do a lot of that sort of thing. Another one, I mean, these sound really small, but we can add this stuff in. Like, for example, when I used to teach right-angle trigonometry, you teach, and I don't do it this way anymore, but, you teach, I don't know, sine first, cosine, tangent, and then it comes to the angles. So now we're going to find an angle. And so traditionally you go, right, stop everyone now, because the next thing you need to know is how to use trigonometry to find an angle. And so you're teaching this thing. And then I was developing this unit. I thought, this is just ridiculous what I'm doing. And I wanted to create a unit that had students actually understanding what they were doing. And so I designed this worksheet series. God, there's a lot to talk about here. One of the problems with right-angle trigonometry is the compartmentalizing of things. So we do the sine scenario, we do the cosine scenario, we do the tangent scenario, and by then I've lost 75% of the class because they have no freaking idea what's going on, right? Because they're just following what I'm doing. It makes no sense. So I just thought, this is ridiculous. I started doing this before I even had dynamic software. I just looked at it and thought, this is all similar triangles. And so I did this approach where, and I was just doing freehand, can you see if these triangles are the same shape, can you see the ratio of these sides is going to be the same? And they all go, yeah, it's obvious, right? And we just sort of went from there. But then I designed this worksheet series where they had to choose, they understood, I taught them the trigonometric sentence, how that works, but they had to work out for each diagram whether it was a sine, cos, or a tan. So they're thinking straight up. So technically, oh, this is too hard. No, it's not. It's not hard at all, but they have to think about it. And then this is a sine situation, so we're going to use that, and away they go. And so the engagement was through the roof. This is for like those sort of middle of the road kids who would normally just go, oh, get me out of here. And they were getting it, right? Because there's something about, because they had to think. They weren't just copying what I was doing, they had to think. But then I threw in on about page 2 or 3 a question where they had to find an angle. I didn't mention it. Mr. Andrew, there's a question. It says find an angle. Now that's your smart, your fastest kid's got there first. So you humour Johnny because he needs to be humoured, and you just go, Johnny, you'll be right. Just have a look at it. You'll be fine. But you're waiting for Peter, Paul, and Mary to come along as well. And then when they do, you go, right, you four, I need to do a quick mini lesson. Just stop everyone. I'm just gonna. Has anyone else got to hear? Right. So you 5, the rest of you can either listen or not. So your choice. But you 5, eyes to me, and you do the quick mini lesson on how to find an angle. It takes a third of the time as your normal lecture, because when you do your normal lecture, most of the kids don't need it anyway yet. They're not ready for it, right? And you do that, and they're off and running. So it's much more self-paced. So the kids are, moving through this series at their own pace. And then you get another group of 3 or 4 hit that same spot, and you do it again and again. Well, what? So you teach things 3 or 4 times, Richard? Yeah, and so do you, because most people aren't listening to your whole class lecture anyway, right? And then at the end of that worksheet series, this is like 2-3 lessons into the unit, you're dropping them into the text like 2/3 the way through, because they don't need to do all that extra practice. And so you're saving 3 or 4 lessons in a unit of work, simply because built into this program is much more thinking that goes on. And I sort of call it the brick wall scenario. You get them to hit some brick walls. Because and these sound like really minor things, but when a group of kids put their hand up and say, I've hit this thing, I don't know what to do here, that's so much better than the teacher going, right, stop everyone, because I know what you need to know next, even if you're not really ready for it, but I'm not going to say that, and you do this lesson, and half of them don't even need it, so they're not paying attention. So that's one kind of little scheme that can be used for any unit.
So now let's talk, though. Let's unpack that, because what you've just described is incredibly complex.
You think so?
Yes.
Why is that complex?
Because you had to first think about this unit. You first had to recognize, you had to notice this unit is going to be miserable. I've done it. It's terrible. Kids are going to be bored. Then you had to think about how could I make it into a need to know? And much of what we think about is when we go to a need to know is what's the real life task, a real life something you can do with that. And so then you get stuck in this like cycle of, well, what can I give them that's real life? And so actually the problem that I really love when we start trigonometry is just which steps are steepest, and articulate why they're steepest. So then, because I think for me, the issue with trigonometry is they don't recognize that they don't have enough experience with ratios to understand that it's a ratio situation. They typically think linearly and not, I think trigonometry is a ratio situation, which is new to them. So then you have to think about what experiences can they have that push them into a place to need to know. And so I think, and then you had to write the curriculum. You had to write your own curriculum that did what you needed it to do to get them to a certain point. So I think actually what you just described is really complex.
Yeah, but if you put, well, it's in a little, that the whole thing is in a little 1 hour mini course that people can do for, I might have given away for free sometimes. If you present that to people and as a, here's a way you can tackle right angle trigonometry, but don't just think about it as right angle trigonometry. There's fundamental things in here, principles that you can apply to anything. So you can start teachers off on that, and then that can start them thinking about, okay, so there's a need to learn. There's block practice versus, what's the other thing? Block practice. And so instead of doing block practice, which is the same question over and over again, interleaved, right? Interleaving. So, you mix things up a bit. Well, there was a bit of that interleaving in my worksheet because every question's different. They can't do the same question and then switch the brain off and just repeat, because every situation is different, because they had to think, right? There's an idea. Let's have kids thinking. So, like another little thing, some kid puts their hand up and Mr. Ando, I don't understand this question. So read the question out. And that what they're trying to do in their head is remember, look at that question and remember what I told them, which thing that I told them that they can apply. So my default kind of statement would be, look, forget the maths. Give me your brain, right? This is what we're doing. And then like you've just walked into the shop and you've seen this and so what I'm trying to say is, look, forget what you think you're meant to be remembering. Let's just use your brain. If you can give me your brain, and together we can walk you through this. And I get halfway through that process and they go, oh, so you mean you just do this? And I go, that's it. So as soon as they start thinking for themselves, right? Then they're on a way. And I think that's where, see, most kids think that mathematics lessons is about remembering what the teacher said and applying the right thing to the right question. And if that's it, then we should just give up, because that's the worst. It's a waste of time. Let's just give kids more arts, more whatever, because don't do that, because it's pointless. It's ridiculously pointless. And if you don't believe me, go and read the Mathematician's Lament.
And so this is where I say, I think you have to approach it systemically, though. You've got to get every teacher thinking the same way, because if a kid, I don't know, Dan Meyer talks about they come pre-installed with a virus. If they come to grade 9 pre-installed with a virus that math is about copying teachers, then now grade 9, I'm going to all of a sudden say, that's not what math's about. Math's about thinking, and it's beautiful and it's connected.
Yeah.
So I think we have to think systemically about this problem. Because
I agree, but the problem is then you get teachers go, well, there's nothing I can do, because for 9 years, until we change the whole school, until the primary school change, it's always the primary school's fault, right?
Right.
No, find a primary teacher who really knows how to do, who's comfortable having 10 different things happening in their classroom, and go and watch them teach, because they really know their stuff, right? That's what teaching is. And I'm not saying that every primary teacher, I've seen some primary teachers in action, and it just blows my head off, because
I do. I'm so in awe of what they can do.
Because, anyway, can I just mention this real life thing? Because I think this is quite a trap. Yes, relevance is important. But I was speaking to a head of maths a couple of years ago. I recorded these things, like a video interview. He had done one of my maths agency PDs with his team. So that's one of the reasons why I was talking to him. But he said, when a kid starts saying to me, oh, this is boring, or, what do we have to know this for? I realize that they've missed a step. There's something that they don't understand. That's what causes that comment. And I used to think when kids said, when are we ever going to need this? I used to think that they want relevance. No, they don't. What they're saying is, Mr. Andrew, this is rubbish. Can I leave? Can I get out that door? That's really what they're saying. Because I used to answer their question and they weren't interested in my answer. So then my response, and I had really good rapport with these kids. So when that would come to me, I'd say, that's not the question you're asking, is it, Joel? You just want to get out the door quick. And they go, yeah. Because I've had a lot of classes that are so into it and they're not worried about relevance. There's something inherently fun. They don't have to be brilliant mathematicians, but there's something inherently fun with working with your mates on these problems, thrashing out these ideas, and they're using their own thinking. You set up a little situation and they're thrashing it out. Those kids don't ask for relevance. I'm not saying relevance is not a thing, but I reckon there's thousands of hours have been spent individually by teachers trying to work out how to make their curriculum relevant, thinking that that's going to be the answer. But it's not. What's the answer is, how can I instill some agency in these kids? How can I empower them so because with understanding and agency go hand in hand. So you need understanding to get agency, you need agency to get understanding. But what can we do? And I think if we're working with teachers to try to get that change happening, you've got to shine a light on what's not working first. Right? And I think a lot of teachers aren't fully cognizant yet of how chronic the situation is in many classes, where you've got a huge percentage of the kids who really don't get it. If you got inside their heads, I think we'd be staggered at what they're thinking and how much they don't really understand. And yet what they're not understanding is not that difficult. I mean, we're talking basic,
No, I agree with you.
Basic fractions, number work, right? We're not talking about imaginary numbers and integral calculus. We're talking about junior maths that was okay, sort of, and then I hit fractions and, oh man, I gave up. Or they get past that and I was okay, but then I hit coordinate geometry, straight line graphing, and I just lost the plot. And it's largely because of compartmentalisation. I mean, the amount of compartmentalisation, if you teach fractions, decimals, and percentages, I did some videos on this, the amount of compartmentalisation that occurs and the number of tiny little rules they're supposed to remember, it's impossible. It's impossible to learn. And I say fractions, decimals, percentages, and throw ratios in it because it's all one topic. So, no, we teach them as 4 different topics. Well, there's half the problem right there, right? It's got to be taught, teach it 4 or 5 times, but teach a bit of all of that. So as they know that half is 50%, is 0.5, it's all interchangeable. But like, if you want to make it as inaccessible as possible, then throw all the different procedures at them, to cancel down, find the highest common factor and divide top and bottom, and then invert and multiply when you divide, and all the rules for adding fractions with different denominators, and it's just a dog's breakfast for anyone who doesn't understand it.
I think not only does it defeat understanding, it defeats the understanding of the beauty of the discipline. Because when you said earlier, that's not about relevance. It's not about giving kids relevant problems, because typically you're not going to find a really relevant problem. It's about finding problems that help them unpack the meaning of the math. And that in itself is a beautiful thing.
Right.
And so I think that, and you can't unpack the beauty of the math when you're learning, today I'm going to find the least common multiple, and then tomorrow I'm going to find the greatest common factor, and I'm going to then tomorrow figure out common denominators, because you're not seeing, there's no beauty in the math there. And so I think there's a lot of brain research that says if we have aha moments, they're beautiful moments. And you get a dopamine rush, you might as well be, having a little cocaine hit, because it does the same thing in your brain. But when we break it down into these little things, we miss the opportunities for making connections. We miss the opportunity for the beauty of the mathematics, and we miss the opportunity for those joyful moments that kids can have when they see something that they never saw before.
So let me throw an idea at you. This sort of came from me using open-ended questions, but concept-specific open-ended questions. So there's open-ended questions which are essentially, beautiful mathematical investigations. We need to create a basketball court down in the quadrangle, and so pair up, and you've got to put down all the steps of how you're going to do that, or something like that. So that's an investigation which involves all sorts of mathematics. But I'm talking about, okay, we've got a problem here because I've taught perimeter really well and I've taught area really well, but for some reason the kids are mixing up the formulas, right? Which always happens. I wonder why that is, because they don't understand what they're doing. And so you just simply throw it out as an open-ended question. Maybe we're working with squares and triangles, and rectangles. So come up with 4 quadrilaterals that have a perimeter of 18. And you workshop this all the time, right? And then the kids who find it's too easy, you go, right, your side lengths can't be whole numbers. What? What do you mean? Oh, now, yeah, and then the real smart one, right? So your figures have to include a semicircle. You give them a range then, because you never want to try and get a semicircle and then have an exact, because then it changes your perimeter's got to be between 11 and 12. Wow, that changes the whole thing. And meanwhile, you've got these other kids who, but in the workshopping back and forth, it's phenomenal. Like it's one of the best ways I know to consolidate conceptual understanding of something that you're targeting, right? And so I knew this, but I didn't know why. And I'm thinking, so what actually is it about an open-ended question that works so well? And what it is that there's no procedure to follow. They have to understand the concept. They have to work with the concept. And if they don't understand the concept, they can't do it, which is what you want. Because in a normal maths lesson, you've got no idea who understands, because most of the kids are getting the right answer or getting some sort of answer, right? But you don't know if they understand it or not. It's the way you're teaching it, the way I used to teach it, there was no correlation between them following what Mr. Andrew said, getting the right answer, and understanding what is actually going on.
Well, and the other beautiful piece of that is that now, because there are so many different ways to do it, different answers available, different solutions to the same answer, they've done 26 practice problems without knowing they did 26 practice problems. And so now you're talking, go back to where we started with the being efficient. It's way more efficient because they
way more efficient. We started off, I think before we put the camera on, we talked about this misconception that a lot of teachers have. So I'll be the teacher. Look, I'm good at what I do. I know that 70-80% of my kids don't get it, but it's not my fault because I'm doing as best I can. But I'd like to do more of this, exploration, discussion, all that sort of good stuff, but I don't have the time, right? And my argument and your argument is, if we can present maths in a way that they get the conceptual understanding first, and specifically the understanding that underpins the procedure that we're going to teach them, if they understand that, they don't need to do half the practice, and they'll be able to work it out in the test, in the assessment, because we've empowered them to think. How is that not obvious? But most, I don't know whether these ideas.
How many teachers do you think have had opportunities to learn math like this? And I think
as a student,
or I mean, maybe in college teaching courses, they've learned it. But most of us, I never, as a high school kid or as a college kid, had an experience like this. I had to go to professional development when I was 35 before I was like, oh, that's what it feels like to really learn math. And when we don't have those experiences, I don't know. It's impossible. Like I was saying before we started, I didn't know. I knew all the words and I knew that they sounded beautiful and that's what I wanted to create when I read stuff from NCTM or wherever. I just didn't know what it felt like. I didn't know what it looked like and how to make it a reality in my classroom. And so once I had an experience of learning like this, it really opened my mind to, I get what it feels like And once I knew what it felt like, then I could think about how I created those experiences for kids. But our teachers haven't had those experiences much either.
And that's what the PD is all about. I mean, I've been running PD like this since 2013. There's so much PD out there, but no, for some reason, schools are prepared to throw lots of money at PD, but no one seems to ask the question, but is this going to make a change in teachers' practice? No one seems to ask that question. I've still got PD, but I'm not focusing on that so much anymore. But if I do get the chance, I'm going to throw two things with the maths front. One is to get people to think about, well, first of all, we start off with what's the difference between passive and active learning? Because I want teachers to realize, okay. Active learning, in other words, kids thinking, kids doing, kids collaborating, kids getting some aha moments. That's really important, right? So how do we do that? So the next thing is, what's your default approach, Richard? The Richard who started teaching. Yes, well, I can tell you what it is. My procedures first. Hope that understanding happens. In other words, what do you do 80% of the time, 90% of the time? Right, that's what I do. Does it produce passive or active learning? 100% passive, because they're just replicating what I'm showing them, right? That's the first step. All right, so do you agree that we need to shift? Now, I'm not saying you got to drop everything that you're doing, but what can we do so as, okay, you're saying that 80% of your time it's passive. Could we change that to 60% and you could do 40% that's active learning now? Well, that would make a huge difference. Let's have a look at some things that you could do that starts to empower kids to give them some agency. Like, let's come up with some questions that don't have a procedure to follow. They don't have to be open-ended questions. That they could be like, we were talking fractions before. Well, you could have a whole lot of shapes on a page and they kind of fill in the lines, and you wanting them to see the equivalent fractions, or work out how many 20ths is 3/4 if they don't know what that is yet, so that they're actually drawing that on the page and they can see it in front of them, like it's obvious now. That type of scaffolding, it could be anything, just anything where you're working on a concept, but you're not teaching the procedure first up, right? So I did this with coordinate geometry. I've got this activity where that we're working with midpoint, distance, and gradient all on the same grid. So here's 2 points, work out the distance. The midpoint was easy because they could just do that on the thing, right? Just look at it, and they're working it out using the grids, but they're not thinking of the formula. Gradient, we've already looked at that, so that's rise over run, but they're not necessarily thinking like that. And then the distance, we might have to give a few hints. Could we use Pythagoras for that? So so they're using Pythagoras and all that. So then when you present the formulas, what do they say? Oh, that's what we've been doing for the last 2 lessons. Because they make sense, because that's exactly what they've been doing, right? So instead of teaching the formulas and then giving them a question like that, give them those questions so they're thinking for themselves, and then you hit them with the formulas. Or maybe we're sort of coming up with the formulas ourselves because they think they're helping. You're guiding that there, but then there's some ownership. It makes sense.
Yeah, so, I think one of my favorite things is just, this is the answer. Now, what are the questions?
Yes. Yeah, which is open-ended question.
Yeah, this is an easy way to change it and it puts to exactly the way you're talking about getting kids to think. This is the answer. Now figure out, because that really shifts. And then that also adds, like I said before, all that practice, because they try one, that didn't work. Try this one, that still didn't work. And they're making sense of what midpoint means, what distance means, what gradient means. So
now the other thing, because we're talking about how do we shift teachers from going from fully procedural to something that empowers kids. Implicit in all of this, in that journey, is moving from teacher centricity to student centricity, right? Mm-hmm. It's whether you state it or not, once you start teaching this way, and now you're becoming more of a facilitator, because once you've empowered the kids to start discussing, they're not reliant on you to give instructions every 30 seconds. And then, my gosh, do you start learning what kids can do? The first time I started doing this, I had these kids written off as like lost causes in terms of maths. And I was listening to what these kids were saying and their thinking, and I was so embarrassed that I had no idea they had these abilities, because
Right.
because the way I was teaching, which was purely traditional, did not allow me, the teacher, to understand what they can do. And so the more you free things up, the more you become a facilitator, the more insight you get. And that smashes another misconception, which is, oh, but if I teach this kind of laissez-faire way, which isn't not what I'm saying, but this more free way, I'm going to lose control. No, you're actually going to have a lot more control over the learning, because you're going to know a hell of a lot more about what's going on. So it's another misconception out the window.
And on top of that, you're going to learn a lot more. I mean, I'm astonished by how much math I learned from listening to my kids' misconceptions and go, I had never considered that that's the way a kid would think about it. And then, okay, I get why they're thinking about it that way, because typically they're not thinking about it in a way that's completely like makes no sense. They have some idea and you're like, oh, I see what the issue is here. So I've learned some math because I've now understood the connection between that misconception and what the common conception is.
Yeah,
And I also now know my kid and I can figure out quickly how to solve that problem for them.
exactly. And the other thing is, once you learn to teach this way, there's no going back. It's addictive.
You can't.
And so it still mystifies me as to, there's just so much resistance to teaching this way, but maybe it's presented wrong, or so I was talking about student-centric, the typical story, oh, my kids are so bored with maths, you know, they're against me, that they're not engaged, da da da. Well, and so therefore I can't do student-centric,
Right.
because I've got to have good control. No, there's a catch-22 here, because the reason that they're so bored is because it's 100% teacher-centric. They don't want to do what you tell them to do. I walked into a school where I was really the only maths teacher, and then it grew, and then I became the head of the department. And they're nice kids, but their attitude towards mathematics was atrocious, because they'd only been going for 3 years, and they were all waiting for the maths guy to come along, right? The other teachers who were teaching maths, right? And I knew I had to get them on side. Like, I was an experienced teacher, but to try to teach from the front, lecture format, was really difficult, because there was so many spot fires going on. This is ridiculous. And it's not that they didn't like me. It was just the culture was wrong.
Right.
So I knew that I could develop a student-centric approach in order to get them on side, right? Which sounds counterintuitive. So all I did was break a chapter into lessons. I didn't date it. I just said lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. If you miss a lesson, you've got to catch it up. And in each lesson, there was each lesson contained the homework, because there's another thing. Checking homework was such a waste of time. You lose 20 minutes just checking homework. So I thought, I'll build that into the lesson. So then they've got a bit of choice there. They had to get to the end by a certain date, right? And they had to hand their book in then. And we actually had 2-book system and whatever. But so they had a level of freedom. And so some kids would just slack off on one lesson because, I'm going to do more tonight. And others would really try and churn through. But it empowered them. And slotted in the lessons were like, teacher demonstration or some class investigation or whatever. So, and I did this with every class initially until I got them on side, and then I didn't really need it anymore. But I walked in one day and I'm going, what's going on? Like, get your unit plans out. It says here, teacher's going to start the lesson with blah, blah, blah. I went, yep, I was just testing you, and I knew exactly what I was going to do, but I forgot it was then, so then we launched into that. So it was perfect. But why did I do that? I did that because I wanted to turn around this attitude, and I wanted to empower them. I somehow knew that this was going to work, and it did work. Then I had them on side. But what happened then was, because kids were working through at their own pace, so all these mini lessons would happen like that. Okay, Joel's just asked a question. Who else needs to hear this, right? Year 7, eyes on me. The rest of you can choose to listen or not. Just keep quiet while and you do this mini lesson. And so it's, what is Hattie? I'm not a great Hattie fan, but he talks about just-in-time teaching, right? And this is just-in-time teaching. It sounds subtle, but once I sort of got the hang of it, there's no going back. You're never going to do a teacher-centric thing ever again. But
Yeah.
I think most maths teachers are stuck in teacher centricity because they, to allow kids to spread out is just so, oh my God, how am I going to handle this? Right. So then they're planning 5 lessons for the one class. Well, that's ridiculous. That's not how differentiation should work.
Yeah, no, that doesn't work.
Right. So, we're talking about moving from what doesn't work to what does work. A part of that process is you've got to empower the students. And the only way that students are going to get agency is if they've got a sense of control of what they're doing, and therefore it needs to be somewhat more student-centric. And it doesn't mean it's a Montessori thing. I have nothing against Montessori, but it's very structured and very intentional. But you allow kids some freedoms to make their own choices. And voila, oh my God, it was last lesson Friday. These kids I've never seen them so engaged. Well, that's because you gave them a sense of control. And I think
it still goes back to this idea that we talked about earlier, that it's about seeing the math as something to play with, something beautiful, thing, and it's not a series of steps that I have to learn and memorize and apply. So I think it also starts with both the teacher and the student starting to redefine for themselves, what does it mean to do math or learn math? That we can learn math by doing math rather than we have to learn the math so that then we can do the math, which I think is one of the teacher-centric perspectives. We learn all the math, and then at the end of the unit, we'll do one project. Yeah, and we'll do some math.
It's the wrong way around.
Rather than seeing it the other way around.
It's totally the wrong way around.
You learn math by doing it, not learning it before you do it.
And one more thing, I think there's some simple ideas here. So with this, giving students some choice, right? So I had this revelation years into my career. It's embarrassing to say this, right? And I used to teach fairly traditionally, although I was teaching this way, they still had a text, but most topics I had other things I'd weave in and all that. But when it was text work, I would write on the board what parts of the questions on page numbers that they were to do. Did it for years until I thought, Richard, why are you doing this? This is the most ridiculous thing ever. And then it just was so obvious what to do. It's like, okay, kids. And there's some chapters where you've got lots of parts of questions, right? So here's the deal. You've got to do every question except numbers 5 and 7. For whatever reason, we're not doing 5 and 7. You have to do at least 4 parts of every question. If there's only 4 parts, then you do half or round it up. If there's 3, you've got to do 2. And you've got to do a couple of the harder ones. And you've got to ask yourself, do I understand what I'm doing? Now, if the answer is no, or I'm not sure, do more. If you do your 4 parts and you reckon you've got it, move on. Mm-hmm. It's your call. Well, we could cheat with this, sir. Yeah, of course you could. If you want to cheat, go knock yourself out. But it's not a smart idea, because I don't think any of them did. The engagement level goes through the roof. Just that. I mean, that has to be, doesn't it? Has to be the most basic tip on how to introduce some level of student centricity on the most conservative approach you could possibly imagine teaching mathematics, just going through text questions. But you empower them, then the metacognition kicks in. Oh, do I understand this or don't I? I don't know that I do. I better do another one. So I'm sort of doing this. I'm getting the right answer, but I don't really know what I'm doing, It changes the game completely. And anybody can do that. You can do that with your eyes closed. I mean, and I don't know. I know a lot of schools now work off of, electronic textbooks and all that sort of thing, but you can still do the same thing there.
Well, in my pre-calculus right now, I'm like, you have to do an hour every night. So this is the problem. This is the problem set. Do your hour worth of problems, and then let me know which ones you don't know how to do when you come back to school tomorrow.
Yeah, homework. Right, everyone, put a line under where you're at now, right? And just make sure everyone's done that. Right, homework, 20 minutes. You know what you need to work on, and I'll check it tomorrow.
Right. The only reason it's an hour is because it's an AP course, and we only see them not every day. So
I did hear, I can't remember who it was, but someone was telling me that they were starting this course and they they got their whole syllabus and unpacked it and said, let's spend a few lessons and we're going to go through this and have a look at what we know and what we don't. You've got to work out for yourself. What do you know and what don't you know? And then we'll have some workshops based on, because we'll put you in groups depending on what you need. They realized there was about a third of the program they didn't really need to do much with, right? And I just thought, well, that's an empowering way to tackle something and as a problem-solving exercise. And so I think, that's when I'm saying it's not that hard. I mean, says he who probably spent 10 years transitioning, but I wasn't. I was just, what motivated me was frustration, because I knew I was torturing these kids and I hated it.
And then I was tortured because I was like, why am I doing this to these poor kids?
And it's hard work. Like, here's the thing, right? Didn't we sign up for these lessons where you go in and the lesson's going well, and then all of a sudden you go down this tangent because some kid's done something and everything's firing in the right way, and you head down this path and everyone's on board, and you walk out thinking, I might have just taught the best lesson I've ever taught, and it wasn't even planned. Now, why did that happen? It happened because kids had agency and you were going with the flow, and everything aligned. Because if half the kids didn't have agency, or even a few of them didn't have agency, it wouldn't have worked. So agency is so important. So how do you get there? Well, you've got to be more student-centric, and you've got to get kids thinking and discussing, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if that's what we signed up for, why are we teaching in ways that are not going to have any chance of that happening, except for the very top kids where you might have 80% of your class knowing what you're doing because they can handle that kind of routine methodology. But why not have that sort of thing happen with an average class? Because it can, if they are inquiring. I used to have these so-called average kids who say, "Oh, I'm not that good at maths, but I do like being here." And I say, "Why is that?" "Oh, because we work together and it's kind of fun." That's a big plus for me. This is a kid who would get 60% at best in a test. Because I think if teachers do think about, okay, what little things can I do to make it a bit more student-centered? How can I give them a sense of control? Can I create some sort of need to learn? What a relief. I don't have to try and make everything relevant. I know when a kid says, what do we need this for? It's just because they hate maths. So why do they hate maths? Well, because they're just following what I'm telling them to do, and that's boring. And they don't understand it. And let's walk in thinking, right, I know where we're going. I know we're going to have to cover these next few procedures. What are the concepts underneath them? What can I give them to have them grapple with those concepts before we get to the procedure? And can we just workshop the procedure and pretend that we've come up with the formula and own it? Those things, start it with one lesson, one unit, and see how it goes. And once you do it once, it's just going to slowly weave in to other things as well. That's why I say it's not as difficult as people think. But yeah, okay, there's a lot of moving parts and it is different. But I still think you can teach mathematics relatively conventionally, but conventionally looking, but still having the kids with some control and agency and thinking and communication and all that sort of stuff. And you still have a chunk of your time where they are just sort of getting some practice in.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a need to do some practice. And I like the Peter Liljedahl's words about checking for understanding, because that switches it from practice to student agency. You check your understanding. Tell me what you understand, what you don't. So
yeah, but they could check each other as well.
Yeah, but then they're responsible for deciding which problems to do and figuring out how many do I need to do till I'm sure I understand.
Yeah,
like that.
I used to, with the whole metacognition thing, I used to have a metacognition assignment. It was just like practice for an assessment task. And this is pretty rudimentary stuff, right? But what they had to do is they got all the answers. It's not my role to mark their work. If they got it wrong, they had to do a second attempt, and they had to give themselves a confidence rating, like 10, 20, 30, 40%, 50, 60. So rate each question, which means if you've got a similar question tomorrow in an assessment, how confident are you get it right? And then they had to write a comment. If it's less than 100, write a comment. right? And their mark they got for the assignment was largely based on how well they did that process. It wasn't so much on their answers. So they could do really well and get every question wrong. Because if they think, because that's what I wanted to focus on.
Right.
And I think that was one of the best ways to get, because I just sick of seeing kids just, oh, great, finish my assignment now. Oh, I've got 70%, but who cares, you know? Like I want them to think about what they're doing. So you just got to, you know, even asking in the class, right? Hands up if you know that you know this, right? So I'd say, George wants me to work through. Have a look at question 2 on page. Hands up if you know that you know this, right? So 10 hands go, right? You guys probably don't need to listen to this. The rest of you, I was this way. So do you know that you know? Just asking those sorts of questions all the time. They go, oh, do I know? Do I know? I don't know. Do I? Because if you don't ask the question, they're not going to do it.
Right. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation very much. I love thinking about this stuff with you.
So that's it. I hope you gained something from that. Would love to hear what your takeaways are. This is Richard from Learn, Implement, Share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.